Between 1966 and 1971, a group of 120 Australian soldiers achieved what 500,000 American troops could not. They operated in the same jungles. They faced the same enemy. Yet their kill ratio reached 30-1 while suffering casualties so minimal that Pentagon analysts initially dismissed the reports as fabricated. The United States Department of Defense called it statistically impossible. British SAS instructors who trained them said no unit could sustain such performance under combat conditions for 5 consecutive years. Every military doctrine of the era predicted their failure. They succeeded anyway. You think you know elite forces? You're wrong. The Navy SEALs get the movies. Delta Force gets the headlines. The SAS gets the legend. But in the green hell of Vietnam, none of them matched what the Australians accomplished. In operations the world has forgotten, how did 120 men outperform 500,000? Why did the Viet Cong abandon entire provinces when Australians arrived? What tactical philosophy allowed them to win firefights they should have lost? Why did American commanders request Australian units but were denied? And why has history buried the most successful Western ground force of the Vietnam War? Stay until the end, because the answer isn't about superior weapons or advanced technology. It's about a single philosophical difference that separated survival from annihilation. And that difference would haunt American military doctrine. For the next 50 years, the year is 1965, America is pouring men and steel into Southeast Asia at a rate never before seen in modern warfare. Operation Rolling Thunder drops more bombs on North Vietnam than were used in all of World War II. American strategy follows a simple equation. War firepower equals more dead enemies equals victory. Helicopter gunships circle above the triple canopy jungle. Artillery fire support bases ring every major installation. B-52 bombers turn grid squares into moonscapes. The doctrine is called overwhelming force. It is the American way of war. It has worked from Normandy to Incheon, but the jungle doesn't care about doctrine. By late 1965, American casualty rates were climbing despite the firepower. Ambushes devastate patrols in seconds. Booby traps kill more men than bullets. The Viet Cong disappear into vegetation so thick that soldiers 10 feet apart cannot see each other. American units call in airstrikes on their own positions just to survive contact. Medevac helicopters extract the wounded under fire daily. The kill ratio hovers around 3-1, sometimes 4-1 on good days. Military planners consider this acceptable. They are wrong. Australia watches from across the Pacific. The government has committed to sending troops as part of the SEATO alliance. But Australian military leadership knows their forces cannot fight like Americans. They don't have an industrial base. They don't have the population. They cannot replace casualties at American rates. If Australian soldiers die at American percentages, the political will at home will collapse within months. The Australian military faces a stark equation. Achieve vastly superior combat effectiveness with inferior numbers, or don't go at all. So they don't go. Not yet. Not until they rewrite every assumption about jungle warfare. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam arrived first in 1962, 3 years before major American deployments. These are not combat units. They are advisors, specialists, men who have spent years fighting communist insurgencies in Malaya and Borneo. While America is still debating the domino theory in Washington conference rooms, Australians are already in Vietnamese villages teaching counterinsurgency. They are learning the terrain. They are studying the enemy. And they are realizing that everything the Americans plan to do is wrong. Warrant Officer Kevin Conway writes in his journal after 6 months in country, "The Americans will bring their war. We must bring a different one." He has fought in the Malayan emergency, where British and Australian forces defeated a communist insurgency that every expert predicted would succeed. The victory came from a tactical philosophy completely opposite to American doctrine. While Americans rely on overwhelming firepower, the Malayan veterans rely on something else entirely: patience, stealth, and the willingness to hunt rather than patrol. By 1966, when the first Australian task force deploys to Phuoc Thu province, they carry with them lessons written in blood across a dozen jungle wars the Americans never studied. The American way is to announce presence, establish fire-based superiority, and force the enemy to either fight or flee. The Australian way is to become invisible, learn enemy patterns over weeks of observation, and strike only when victory is certain. The Americans want to find the enemy. The Australians want the enemy to never know they exist until the ambush is already over. The philosophical difference seems subtle. In practice, it will mean the difference between a 4-to-1 kill ratio and 30-to-1. Phuoc Thu province in 1966 was a Viet Cong country. The province sits 60 miles east of Saigon, a strategic position controlling access to the capital. The terrain is unforgiving: dense jungle, rubber plantations, swamps, and the long high hills where the Viet Cong have built tunnel complexes and supply depots. 2 Viet Cong regiments operate in the province, the 274th and 275th, totaling approximately 5,000 fighters. Local guerrilla forces add another 2,000. They have controlled the province for years. They know every trail, every village, every water source. They expect the Australians to fight like Americans. They are catastrophically wrong. The first Australian task force establishes its base at Nui Gat, a former Viet Cong stronghold. The Americans expect them to build a massive fire base with artillery emplacements, helicopter pads, and wire perimeters. The Australians build something smaller, denser, easier to defend. They are not planning to sit inside their base and send out patrols. They are planning to live in the jungle. The Viet Cong tested them immediately. On August 18, 1966, less than 2 months after the Australians arrived, a force of 2,500 Viet Cong attacked during a thunderstorm. The Battle of Long Tan begins in a rubber plantation when D Company, 6th Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, stumbles into an entire Viet Cong regiment preparing to assault Nui Dat. The Australians are outnumbered 23-to-1. They are cut off from support. The monsoon rain grounds helicopters and turns the ground to mud. Artillery fire from Nui Dat is their only lifeline, but the gunners are firing blind through the storm. American doctrine would call for immediate withdrawal to avoid annihilation. The Australians don't withdraw. They form a defensive perimeter in the rubber trees and hold. For 3.5 hours, they fight at ranges so close that Viet Cong bodies pile up within grenade-throwing distance. The soldiers run out of ammunition and redistribute from the dead. Artillery shells land 50 meters from Australian positions because that's where the enemy is. When the rain finally stops and reinforcements arrive, the battlefield is covered in Viet Cong dead. The count takes 2 days. 245 Viet Cong bodies confirmed. Intelligence estimates at least 350 more carried away. Australian casualties: 18 dead, 24 wounded. The kill ratio at Long Tan is 20-to-1 at minimum, possibly higher. The Viet Cong 275th Regiment effectively ceases to exist as a fighting force. They will not launch another major attack on Australian positions for the remainder of the war. The Pentagon sends analysts to investigate. The numbers don't make sense. How does a company-sized unit hold against a regimental assault and inflict casualties at a rate that defies every combat model? The Australians explain their artillery doctrine. Instead of establishing predetermined Fire support zones, like the Americans. They train gunners to fire danger-close missions in direct communication with forward observers. The shells land so close to Australian lines, the shrapnel peppers their positions. But it works because the gunners are that accurate, and the infantry trusts them completely. The Americans take notes, but don't adopt the practice. It seems too risky, too dependent on individual skill rather than systemic process. They miss the deeper lesson. The Australians succeed because they build doctrine around their people's capabilities, not around institutional safety margins. Long Tan is not an anomaly. This is the introduction. After Long Tan, the Viet Cong changed tactics. They stop attacking Australian positions directly. Instead, they try to avoid the Australians entirely, ceding territory and withdrawing deeper into the jungle. This is exactly what the Australian planners predicted. The Americans view enemy withdrawal as success. The Australians view it as the beginning of the real war, because now they must hunt an enemy who knows they are being hunted by something more dangerous than anything they've faced before. The Special Air Service Regiment, Australia's equivalent to the British SAS and American Special Forces, deploys its squadrons to Phuoc 2 in rotating cycles. These are not direct action raiders like the SEALs or Delta Force would later become. They are reconnaissance specialists, trained in a doctrine developed during the Malayan Emergency: long-range patrol, intelligence gathering, ambush, and above all, patience. A typical SAS patrol consists of 4 to 6 men. They insert by helicopter into remote jungle, then operate independently for weeks at a time without resupply or external support. Their mission is not to kill as many enemies as possible. Their mission is to gather intelligence and strike only when the tactical advantage is absolute. In American Special Forces culture, contact with the enemy is often the objective. In Australian SAS culture, contact means something went wrong. The perfect patrol gathers intelligence, sets an ambush, eliminates the target, and extracts without the enemy ever knowing who hit them or where they came from. This requires a level of field craft and fire discipline that most American units consider unrealistic for sustained operations. The Australians prove it is not only realistic, but devastatingly effective. Sergeant Major Harry Smith, a Long Tan veteran, later joins SAS operations. He describes the tactical philosophy: we don't patrol to make contact. We patrol to own the ground. The enemy should feel like ghosts are watching them, because ghosts are watching them. And when we decide to kill them, they should die confused. This sounds like psychological operations theory, but it is pure tactical doctrine. The Viet Cong begin reporting to their commanders that Australians appear and disappear without sound. They set ambushes along trails that the Viet Cong considered secure for years. They seem to know Viet Cong movements before the Viet Cong themselves finalize plans. The secret is time, while American units patrol for days or maybe a week before. Rotating back to base, Australian SAS teams stay out for 3 weeks, sometimes 4. They move slowly, sometimes covering only a few hundred meters per day. They observe Viet Cong trails for days before acting, learning patterns of movement, timing of patrols, locations of rest stops. When they finally spring an ambush, it is not a chance encounter. It is a surgical strike planned down to the individual target, the direction of escape routes, and the timing of withdrawal. The kill ratio on SAS ambushes frequently exceeds 50-1. Because the enemy never gets a chance to return effective fire. Trooper Peter Tinley participates in an ambush that becomes legendary within SAS circles. His 4-man patrol spends 11 days observing a Viet Cong supply trail in the long high hills. They catalog every patrol, every supply runner, every timing pattern. On the 12th day, intelligence indicates a high-value target will move along the trail. A Viet Cong political officer and his security element, 12 men total. The SAS team sets a claymore mine ambush with interlocking fields of fire. When the target enters the kill zone, the entire ambush lasts 7 seconds. All 12 Viet Cong died. The SAS team suffers 0 casualties. They withdraw and are extracted by helicopter 30 kilometers away before the Viet Cong even discover the bodies. The Americans request details of the operation to replicate the success. The Australians provide an after-action report, but it doesn't translate. The American system is built on speed and overwhelming force. Units deploy for specific missions, execute, and return to base. The concept of spending 11 days watching. A trial to kill 12 men seems inefficient when American doctrine focuses on body count metrics and operational tempo. The Americans see 12 dead enemies. The Australians see the disruption of an entire supply network, because now every Viet Cong unit in the region knows that even their secure trails are compromised. The psychological impact is more valuable than the body count. By 1967, the first Australian task force had established a reputation that transcends normal military respect. The Viet Cong began calling Phuoc Thu province the land of ghosts. Captured documents reveal that Viet Cong commanders issue standing orders to avoid contact with Australian forces if possible and to never pursue Australians who withdraw, because the withdrawal is likely a trap. One document captured in 1968 instructs the Australians do not move like Americans. They are silent. They wait. Retreat when you see them, because the ones you see are not the ones who will kill you. This is not propaganda. This is tactical intelligence from an enemy learning through bitter experience. The conventional infantry battalions, the 5th and 6th Royal Australian Regiment, operate differently than the SAS, but with the same philosophical foundation. American infantry tactics in Vietnam rely on the reconnaissance by fire method. Patrols move through the jungle firing randomly into suspected enemy positions to trigger ambushes on their own terms. The theory is that it's better to trigger an ambush when you're ready than to be ambushed when you're not. The practice is loud, ammunition intensive, and alerts every enemy within 2 kilometers to your presence. Australian battalions forbid reconnaissance by fire. Their patrols move in complete silence. Soldiers use hand signals. They avoid trails. They move so slowly that a day's patrol might cover less ground than an American unit covers in 2 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Kahn commanded the 6th RAR in 1967. He enforces march discipline that American advisors consider excessive. Soldiers are not allowed to speak. Radio communication is minimized. Smoking is forbidden on patrol. Food is cold rations only, because cooking fires produce smell and smoke. Magazines are taped together to prevent rattling. Equipment is tied down so it doesn't clank. Soldiers learn to walk heel-toe to minimize noise on dried leaves. The result is patrols that move through the jungle like the jungle itself, invisible. And silent. When Australian patrols do make contact, the violence is sudden and absolute. Instead of calling for air support or artillery and waiting for it to arrive, Australian infantry is trained to win the firefight with organic weapons immediately. Every soldier carries more ammunition than American counterparts. Machine gunners carry twice the ammunition load. The theory is that the first minute of contact determines the outcome, so the first minute must be overwhelmingly violent. After the initial contact, the Australians either assault through the ambush to finish the enemy or withdraw under covering fire before the enemy can organize a response. They rarely stay in place, trading fire like American units often do. Sergeant Lou Williams participated in 47 contacts during his tour with 6th RAR. He survives all of them without serious injury. He describes Australian contact doctrine. The Americans suppress and maneuver. We are just violence. First contact. Every man empties his first magazine into the enemy position in 30 seconds. Then we either go through them or we're gone. Before they recover, we don't do firefights. We do executions or escapes. This sounds like bravado, but the casualty statistics support it. Australian infantry suffer significantly fewer casualties per contact than American units because they either win the fight in the opening seconds or disengage before the enemy can bring effective fire. The Viet Cong learned to fear Australian patrols more than American firepower. American artillery and airstrikes are terrifying, but survivable in tunnels and bunkers. Australian ambushes are intimate, sudden, and leave no survivors. Viet Cong units begin rooting when they realize they've encountered Australians. This is not cowardice. This is rational tactical assessment from an experienced enemy who understands that fighting Australians in close terrain is suicide. The weapon that becomes the symbol of Australian dominance is not high-tech or uniquely Australian. It is the L1A1 self-loading rifle, the Australian version of the Belgian FN FAL. The Americans carry the M16, a lightweight assault rifle firing a small 5.56 millimeters round designed for controllability and high rate of fire. The L1A1 fires a 7.62 millimeters NATO round, the same cartridge used in machine guns. It is heavier. It has more recoil. It fires slower. On paper, it is inferior to the M16 for jungle warfare. On the battlefield, the L1A1 becomes legendary. The 7.62 millimeters round punches through jungle foliage that deflects the smaller 5.56 millimeters. It kills at longer ranges. It penetrates cover that stops American rounds. Australian soldiers joke that the L1A1 doesn't wound, it solves problems permanently. More importantly, the rifle almost never jams in jungle conditions, while early M16s suffer chronic reliability. Issues. American soldiers in 1967 are still dealing with M16 malfunctions that get men killed. Australian soldiers never question whether their rifle will fire, but the rifle is just a tool. The real advantage is marksmanship doctrine. American infantry training emphasizes volume of fire. If you're shooting enough bullets, some will hit. Australian training emphasizes first-round accuracy. If you shoot, someone dies. Australian soldiers qualify on rifle ranges out to 600 meters. They practice firing from unconventional positions. They learn to engage targets in low light conditions, without tracers. By the time they deploy to Vietnam, the average Australian infantry soldier is a better marksman than many American designated marksmen. In contact, this difference is stark. American soldiers often fire hundreds of rounds during a brief engagement. Australian soldiers fire dozens. The kill per round ratio heavily favors the Australians, not because their weapon is better, but because every shot is aimed and deliberate. Viet Cong survivors describe Australian fire as precise like executions. Every burst finds a target. There is no suppressive fire for its own sake. When Australians shoot, someone falls. Corporal Jim Riddle keeps an unofficial count during his 1968 tour. In 19 contacts, he fires 347 rounds and is credited with 11 confirmed kills. By American standards, this is impossibly efficient. By Australian standards, it is average performance. The culture of marksmanship is so ingrained that soldiers compete informally to see who can achieve kills with the fewest rounds. This is not callousness. This is professional pride in weapon handling. And in a war where ammunition resupply is uncertain and weight is critical, efficiency keeps you alive. The L1A1 becomes more than a weapon. It becomes the physical representation of the Australian tactical philosophy. Precision over volume, accuracy over suppression, skill over firepower, while Americans are calling in airstrikes measured in tons of ordnance. Australians are achieving the same objectives with a few well-placed bullets. By 1968, the contrast between American and Australian operational results was undeniable. In Phuoc Thu Province, the Viet Cong have lost control of villages they held for a decade. Supply routes are interrupted. Recruitment collapses. The 274th and 275th Regiments are shadows of their former strength. The province that was once considered contested territory is now largely pacified. The Australians achieved this with one task force of approximately 4,500 men, including support units. The combat arms troops actually patrolled the jungle number around 2,500. 50 miles away, in other provinces, 500,000 American troops are fighting the same enemy with less strategic success. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 shocked the American public and military leadership. Viet Cong forces attacked cities and bases across South Vietnam, proving that years of American operations have not crippled enemy capability. In Phuoc Thu, the Viet Cong attempted only minor probing attacks during Tet. They lacked the strength to do more because Australian operations have systematically destroyed their command structure, supply network, and combat units. American commanders notice. General Creighton Abrams, who took over command of U.S. forces in mid-1968, requested Australian units be placed under his operational control for expanded missions. The Australian government refuses. The task force is already stretched thin, covering Phuoc Thu. More importantly, Australian political leadership understands that their military success depends on maintaining their distinct tactical doctrine. Integrating Australian units into the American command structure would pressure them to adopt American operational methods. The very tactics that make them effective would be diluted by institutional pressure to conform. The refusal frustrates American commanders, but proves strategically wise. By maintaining independence, the Australian task force preserves the tactical culture that produces their results. They continue to operate by their own rules: slow patrols, long reconnaissance, ambushes over sweeps, accuracy over firepower. And the results continue to vindicate the approach. Statistical analysis, conducted in 1969 by U.S. Army Operational Research, reveals uncomfortable facts. Per 1,000 troops deployed, Australian forces inflict approximately 7 times more enemy casualties than American forces. Australian casualty rates are roughly 1/3 of equivalent American units. The cost per enemy killed is dramatically lower for Australian operations because they use less ammunition, less artillery, and almost no air support. The efficiency gap is not marginal. It is an order of magnitude difference. The Pentagon studies do not result in doctrinal changes. American military culture is too deeply invested in firepower and technological supremacy to adopt tactics that seem archaic. Silent movement, patient observation, small unit independence. The institutional assumption is that American methods are sound and simply need better execution. The possibility that the entire operational philosophy is flawed for this type of warfare is too threatening to consider seriously. So the studies are filed, the Australians are praised, and nothing changes. The SAS achieves results that border on the mythological. Between 1966 and 1971, approximately 750 Australian SAS soldiers rotated through Vietnam in squadron-sized deployments. These men conduct thousands of patrols deep in enemy territory. Their confirmed kill count exceeds 2,000 Viet Cong. Their own casualties total fewer than 30 dead. The kill ratio is not 30-1. It exceeds 65-1. In some individual operations, entire enemy units are eliminated with 0 Australian casualties. Trooper Gary Mackay describes a 1971 patrol that exemplifies SAS methodology. His 5-man team inserts into the Mae Dao Mountains, a Viet Cong stronghold that American forces avoid because the terrain is too rugged for helicopter support. The team's mission is reconnaissance, locate enemy base camps, and supply caches. They spend 4 weeks in the mountains, moving only at night, hiding during the day, surviving on minimal rations. They discover a base camp complex housing an estimated 200 Viet Cong, a major supply depot, and a training facility. American doctrine would call for an airstrike or a large-scale ground assault. The SAS team requests neither. Instead, they observe the camp for 6 days, mapping patrol patterns, identifying leaders, finding vulnerabilities. On the 7th night, they infiltrate the camp's perimeter and place explosives on the ammunition, bunker, and supply depot. They withdrew to a pre-positioned ambush site covering the main trail out of the camp. At dawn, they detonate the explosives. The camp erupts in secondary explosions as ammunition cooks off. Viet Cong soldiers flee down the main trail directly into the SAS ambush. The 5 Australians killed 43 enemy soldiers in less than 2 minutes. Then they withdraw before the Viet Cong can organize a response. By the time American helicopters arrive for extraction 20 kilometers away, the Viet Cong are still searching the wrong area. The entire operation costs the SAS 0 casualties and destroys a base camp the enemy spent years building. The Americans call it a spectacular success. The SAS calls it a standard patrol. This is not exaggeration or propaganda. After-action reports from SAS operations consistently show casualty ratios that seem impossible. The reason is that SAS selection and training filters for men capable of operating under conditions that would break normal soldiers. They endure weeks of isolation in hostile territory. They make life-and-death decisions without supervision. They exercise fire discipline that requires not shooting even when targets present themselves because the tactical situation isn't perfect. This level of operational maturity is rare even in elite units. The Australian SAS cultivates it systematically. Captain Terry O'Farrell, an SAS troop commander, explains the selection philosophy. We don't want killers. We want thinkers who can kill. Any soldier can shoot a man. We need soldiers who can decide whether shooting that man now or waiting 6 hours to shoot him and his entire squad is the correct tactical choice. Then execute that choice alone in the jungle with no support. Most men can't do that. We find the ones who can. The SAS attracts a particular type of soldier, intelligent, independent, comfortable with ambiguity, and willing to endure extreme discomfort for tactical advantage. These are not superhuman traits, but they are rare enough that only a small percentage of volunteers complete selection. The result is a unit where every member is capable of operating at a level that would be considered exceptional in conventional forces. When you multiply that individual capability across a small team with perfect coordination, the results are devastating to an enemy not prepared for that level of tactical sophistication. The Viet Cong are not stupid. They are experienced jungle fighters who have defeated the French and are holding their own against American firepower. But they are doctrinally unprepared for the Australian approach. Communist military theory emphasizes mass and momentum. Attack. Weak points with superior numbers. Withdraw before enemy firepower responds. Repeat until the enemy collapses. It worked against the French. It is working against the Americans, at least in the sense that it makes the war unwinnable for the U.S. at acceptable cost. Against the Australians, it fails completely. Viet Cong doctrine assumes the enemy will be loud, predictable, and reliant on technology. Australian patrols are silent, unpredictable, and rely on fieldcraft over technology. Viet Cong tactics assume they can observe enemy movements and avoid large units while ambushing small ones. but they cannot observe what moves invisibly, and Australian small units are more lethal than Viet Cong large ones. The tactical assumptions that work against Americans become liabilities against Australians. A captured Viet Cong commander provides insight during interrogation in 1969. Asked why his unit abandoned area when Australians arrived but returned when Americans took over, he responded, "Americans, we can fight. We take casualties, but we survive and they leave. Australians, we cannot fight. When we fight them, we die. All of us. So we leave and wait for them to leave. But they don't leave. They stay and hunt us. So we must abandon the area or be killed. Slowly. This is the strategic impact the statistics cannot capture. Australian operations don't just inflict casualties. They deny the enemy the ability to operate in entire regions. The Viet Cong can absorb high casualties if they maintain operational freedom. They cannot function when they lose freedom of movement. And Australian tactics systematically strip that freedom by making every trail, every camp, every supply route feel compromised. The Viet Cong become paralyzed by uncertainty, never knowing if the next step will trigger an ambush by an enemy they never saw. The psychological toll is severe. Viet Cong units operating in areas with Australian presence show declining morale in captured documents. One letter from a Viet Cong soldier to his family, intercepted in 1970, describes, "We do not sleep well. Every sound could be them. We move and wonder if they watch us. When someone disappears on patrol, we find the body days later in an ambush that is cold and empty. They are ghosts who kill and vanish. I would rather fight 10 Americans than one." Australian. This is battlefield effectiveness that transcends kill ratios. The Australians achieve strategic paralysis of enemy forces through tactical excellence. They are not winning hearts and minds. They are breaking enemy will through. Relentless competence. Yet the story remains largely unknown. American military history focuses on American operations. Ia Drang, P San, Hamburger Hill. Australian operations in Phuoc Tu receive footnotes if mentioned at all. The most successful Allied ground combat unit of the Vietnam War is absent from popular memory. The reasons are complex, but ultimately political. Australia's contribution of 4,500 troops is dwarfed numerically by America's 500,000. Australian casualties, while low relative to their success, are still painful for a nation of only 12 million people. When the war becomes unpopular, Australian political leaders have no incentive to highlight military success that might prolong involvement. The Australians withdrew from Vietnam in 1971. The decision is political, not military. Phuoc Tu Province is the most secure region in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong infrastructure is shattered. Villages that were enemy strongholds in 1965 are now peaceful. The task force could remain indefinitely at minimal cost. But Australian public opinion has turned against the war, and the government responds. The troops come home not in defeat, but in quiet accomplishment. When the Americans withdrew in 1973 and South Vietnam collapsed in 1975, Phuoc Tu fell with the rest. The Viet Cong units the Australians defeated are long gone, replaced by North Vietnamese regulars equipped with tanks and artillery. The fall of the province is strategic collapse, not tactical failure. The Australians defeated the enemy they faced. They could not prevent the invasion that came later. In the decades after, Vietnam became America's defining military trauma. The defeat colors military doctrine for a generation. American forces adopt new tactics for counterinsurgency, many of which quietly incorporate lessons from Australian operations without acknowledging the source. The emphasis on small unit leadership, marksmanship, and patrol discipline in modern American Infantry training owes an unspoken debt to the Australians, who proved these approaches worked when American methods failed. The Australian SAS remains relatively unknown outside military circles. They do not seek fame. Their culture values silence and professionalism over recognition. When the unit deploys to Afghanistan and Iraq in the 21st century, they bring the same tactics that worked in Vietnam: patience, stealth, precision. And they achieve the same results: high kill ratios, low casualties, mission success. The modern American media covers SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force operations. Australian SAS operations remain classified or ignored. The soldiers prefer it that way. The central mystery is not how they achieved it. The methods are documented: superior fieldcraft, better marksmanship, patient reconnaissance, and a tactical philosophy built on precision rather than firepower. The mystery is why the lessons were not adopted. The United States had access to all the after-action reports, all the statistics, all the tactical manuals. Australian advisors offered to train American units in their methods. Some American units, particularly Special Forces and Marine Corps reconnaissance units, did learn and apply Australian tactics with excellent results. But the institutional Army and the broader military culture never embraced the approach. The answer lies in competing philosophies of warfare. American military culture is built on industrial might, the belief that superior resources properly applied will overwhelm any enemy. This worked in World War II, when American industry outproduced the Axis powers. It worked in Korea, when American firepower held the line. The institutional identity of the U.S. military is tied to technological and industrial superiority. Tactics that succeed through individual skill and fieldcraft, rather than systemic, overwhelming force, are philosophically threatening. Australian military culture grew from different roots. As a smaller nation, Australia could never match enemies. Through industrial output, their military tradition from Gallipoli through Malaya emphasized the quality of the individual soldier over the quantity of resources. This created a culture where tactical excellence was not just valued, but necessary for survival. Australian soldiers were taught that they would often be outnumbered and would need to win through superior skill. This assumption shaped doctrine. From training through deployment. In Vietnam, both philosophies were tested in the same environment against the same enemy. The American approach achieved strategic stalemate at enormous cost. The Australian approach achieved tactical dominance at minimal cost, but lacked the strategic weight to affect the war's outcome. Neither philosophy was definitively validated or refuted, which allowed both military cultures to continue believing their approach was fundamentally correct. But the soldiers knew. American troops who operated alongside Australians universally praised their effectiveness. Many tried to adopt Australian methods within their own units. The problem was institutional. The U.S. military's training, logistics, and command structure were all built around the firepower-intensive approach. Changing tactics at the small unit level while maintaining the existing institutional framework produced mixed results. True adoption would have required systemic change that was organizationally and politically impossible during an ongoing war. So the Australians went home. Their success acknowledged, but not replicated. The lessons remained available, but unused. And 50 years later, when American forces found themselves fighting new insurgencies in new jungles and deserts, they had to relearn many of the same lessons at tremendous cost. The symbolism crystallizes in a single object, the L1A1 rifle. Not the weapon itself, but what it represented. While Americans carried the M16, a symbol of technological advancement and industrial production, Australians carried a rifle designed for accuracy and reliability. The M16 was lighter, faster, more modern. The L1A1 was heavier, slower, and brutally effective. The contrast embodied the philosophical divide. American emphasis on technological edge versus Australian emphasis on fundamental effectiveness. When American soldiers encountered jammed M16s in firefights, some took L1A1 south from Australian supply dumps. This was technically illegal, a violation of standardized weapons protocols, but survival overrides regulation. The soldiers who made the switch understood instinctively what the doctrine writers missed. In close jungle combat, where every shot matters, reliability and stopping power trump rate of fire and weight savings. The rifle that worked every time was superior to the rifle that worked most of the time. This practical wisdom from soldiers on the ground rarely reached decision-makers in rear echelons. The reports went up the chain, filtered through layers of command, each layer with institutional interests in defending existing systems. By the time combat lessons reached the Pentagon, they were sanitized into recommendations for minor adjustments rather than fundamental changes. The M16's problems were eventually fixed through design improvements. The tactical lessons about precision over volume were quietly forgotten. Australian soldiers returning home did not publicly criticize American methods. Their culture valued professionalism over pride. When asked about their success, it credited training and luck in equal measure. The kill ratios were never intended as comparison or competition. They were simply the result of fighting the only way that made sense given their limitations and strengths. That their way proved superior was almost accidental, but within military circles, the truth was understood. The Australians had demonstrated that small, highly skilled units using conventional weapons could outperform large forces equipped with advanced technology in complex terrain. This was not a comfortable lesson for nations that built their military power on technological and industrial supremacy. So the lesson was acknowledged and then politely ignored. The epilogue is written not in victories, but in survival. Of the 750 Australian SAS soldiers who deployed to Vietnam over 5 years, 700 came home. The casualties were real. 30 men dead. Each one mourned. Each loss felt deeply in such a small community. But the survival rate exceeded 93%, despite operating in the most dangerous missions in the most hostile territory. For comparison, American Special Forces units suffered casualty rates approximately 3 times higher. The difference was not luck. It was the cumulative effect of tactical decisions made thousands of times. The choice to wait rather than engage, to withdraw rather than pursue, to strike only when victory was certain. This is the larger truth the Australian experience reveals. In war, patience is often more lethal than aggression. The cultural narrative around warfare celebrates boldness and decisive action. The reality is that in complex environments against adaptive enemies, restraint and careful planning outperform impulsive aggression. The side that moves fastest is not always the side that wins. Sometimes the side that moves slowest, sees clearest, and strikes hardest at the decisive moment is the side that survives. The Australians understood this not through superior intellect, but through necessity. They could not afford to fight like Americans because they could not afford American casualty rates. Limitation forced innovation. The innovation proved superior. And yet, the lesson remains unlearned by larger powers who never faced the constraint of limited resources. In the end, the Vietnamese jungle consumed everything. American firepower, Viet Cong resilience, political will from a dozen nations. What it could not consume were the Australians who learned to move through it like shadows, who understood that survival depended not on conquering the jungle, but becoming part of it. They went into that green hell and emerged largely intact, having achieved what everyone said was impossible. The kill ratios tell one story. 30 to 1, 50 to 1, 65 to 1, numbers that seem fictional. But the real story is in what the numbers represent. Each one is a tactical decision made correctly under pressure. Each one is a soldier who mastered skills that most soldiers never learn. Each one is proof that in warfare, excellence matters. More than resources, the Americans had 500,000 troops, unlimited ammunition, total air superiority, and industrial might. The Australians had 120 men in the field at any given time, the rifles on their backs, and training built on a century of fighting as the underdog. The Americans achieved strategic stalemate. The Australians achieved tactical perfection. Neither won the war. But only one proved that size is not strength, that technology is not supremacy, and that the best soldiers are not those with the most resources, but those who need the least. Phuoc Tu province is green again now. The scars of war faded into. The jungle, the bunkers collapsed. The trails are overgrown. The old Nui Dat base is barely visible beneath the vegetation. The jungle reclaimed everything except the memory of the men who understood that to defeat it, you first had to become invisible within it. They were better than SEALs, better than any unit their era produced, not because they claimed to be, but because they proved it in the only place that matters. The close, wet darkness where survival is measured in heartbeats and excellence is. The margin between breathing and bleeding out alone. There were 120 men. They were silent. They were lethal. They were right dot, and history forgot them anyway. But wars are not fought for memory. They are fought for the man beside you, for survival, for the mission. The Australians completed theirs. The recognition, or lack of it, was irrelevant. The work was what mattered. The work was exceptional. The work was enough.